Hey folks, Kevin here. Well, it's August 14th, 2023. I'm sitting down out by the Harbor Freight in the area here, patio area. And I tried a little bit earlier today, before lunch, to try and respond to comments about peach trees and brown rot. So this is about a fungus or group of organisms. But the primary organism that's sought about is a fungal group that are Monilinia fructicola, and they create they are endemic, meaning that they're just naturally occurring in our area, and I would consider them an opportunistic pathogen. So what is a pathogen? A pathogen is an organism, could be a virus, bacteria, protozoa, fungal organism, and other organisms as well, that cause disease, disruption of normal homeostasis. And when I say opportunistic, what I'm talking about isn't something that has a really high virulence, aggressiveness and ability to knock the snot out of a person or out of a tree. It has a relatively low level of virulence, but since there's such an increased number of them in an environment, once we get the disease process going on in our trees, it can be a big problem. So what are the systems that I've talked about that we've implemented here to try and control the brown rot? So we first got brown rot several years ago after the deer rub during rutting season. So a lot of the tissues, the primary protective mechanisms, the bark and all, were really damaged and all. Now we have almond trees, we have peach, plum, pluots, apricot plum crosses, cherries, nectarines. So by having all of those common trees that are all susceptible to the brown rot, this primary fungal disease, it can set up shop in your orchard or in your permaculture site, and that's what happened here. Now I have removed a couple of trees that have had systemic infection, meaning that it's much more than just in the bud or in the flower or in the fruit itself. It's actually under the bark and systemically involved in the tree itself. So removing any severely affected trees is probably important, but the first step is removing all affected fruit. So that's picking up, raking up, gathering all of the fruit and depositing them in a location where you're not worried about that contaminated. So a couple hundred yards away from where your food forest is. Removing any damaged, diseased, or dysfunctional limbs, or like in our cases, we have wire cages that I built for tomato support cages and all, where the limbs have actually rubbed against those and damaged the protective layer. And I'm trying not to babble on about this. And so the first thing is removing all of the obviously diseased components. The disease is still there, even if you remove all the obvious components. Removing all of the damaged limbs, doing whatever you can to protect all of the rest of the tree. But anything that looks diseased or damaged, remove it. Now the fungal elements will still be in the fruit buds, in the flower, and in the fruit itself. So many people will use sulfate-containing compounds, copper sulfate, and other fungicides. We haven't used that here, and it's because the reason that I chose not to use it was I really wanted to try and see if we can control the problem. I haven't eradicated the problem. It's endemic to our environment, and every time that limbs get damaged, or if it's in the tree and I don't remove all the fruit, well, it's just going to proliferate and start to spread from there. So I haven't used the fungicides, and the main reason that I didn't use it is because, well, I'll give you the analogy. Many of us nowadays know that taking antibiotics indiscriminately not only leads to bacterial resistance, so meaning that the antibiotics are no longer going to be effective at treating the underlying infectious process they have going on in your body. And it's the same thing with everything else, with other organisms as well besides people. But the other thing that antibiotics do is they're not smart bombs. They go ahead and they take out many different other organisms in our bodies. So that's why people will often say, oh, we should give the person, after having antibiotics, probiotics. And probiotics will only last so long, so you should also give them prebiotics. Those are the food sources for the beneficial organisms, the quote-unquote probiotics that we're taking. And I'm starting to go off on these little tangents again, but I want it to make sense as far as my approach to this whole process. So by using a fungicide or doing a generalized treatment, we're not just knocking out the opportunistic pathogenic fungal organisms that are bothering us and bothering the tree. We're knocking out other potential beneficial organisms. Now, what stimulated me to create this recording? Well, I had a comment, probably on one of my old brown rot videos in the peach forest, and whoever this was, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name right now, but they discussed how they had been painstakingly picking up all of the debris, pruning appropriately, and dealing with this for 3 years, and been spraying each year. The one thing that when people typically talk about treating brown rot, they'll talk about using sulfur-containing compounds to kill the fungi, but they don't talk about what to do afterwards. It's sort of like, oh, should you take a probiotic or a prebiotic, or a prebiotic to reestablish the normal flora. So trees are not, I mean, they're dissimilar to us, but I analogize them to the point that there's protective layers. There's innate protective layers, like we have skin that protects our body from getting infection when harmful bacteria, just our hands and arms get exposed to harmful bacteria and fungi. And the reason is because we have intact skin and we have a colony of beneficial, a microbiome, organisms that are on the surface of our skin, as well as in intact skin. So if we were to use topical antibiotics on the outside of our skin, we may be indiscriminately affecting many different beneficial commensal organisms. So when I say commensal, or mutualism forms. So there's 3 types of symbiotic relationship. There's parasitic, commensal, and mutualism. So parasitic is when one organism is benefited by its interaction with another organism, and the other organism suffers as a result. So that's parasitism, and we can all think about that. Commensalism is when one organism is benefited, but it doesn't hurt or help the other organism, the one that's let's say feeding on or consuming the fruit of. And then we have a mutualism is when both parties, both of the organisms are benefited. So what we want to do, if we are, at least my recommendation based on my background, I'm not a horticulturist, I'm not a master gardener, I'm not a botanist, I'm a retired veterinary internal medicine specialist with another degree in zoology and biochemistry. And so that's where I'm getting all of my thought processes from. So if we do elect to treat with a fungicide, probably we should try and treat it with some beneficial microorganisms to competitively inhibit those opportunistic pathogens, like I mentioned, they're endemic in the environment, meaning that they persist in the environment and under ideal conditions, heat and humidity, or disruption of the normal defensive mechanisms, such as treatment with a fungicide. It might be beneficial to use to expose those trees to beneficial microorganisms, ones that will either be commensal or be mutualism, one of those two categories, not parasitic. So I'm hoping this is making sense. So a couple of years ago, I bought this gallon bottle here of EM1, which is essential micronutrients. I believe in this one. There's like lactobacillus, there's beneficial yeast, and there's aerobic bacteria and photosensitive bacteria as well, phototrophic bacteria. So by reestablishing some of the normal microorganisms that are on the leaves, that are on the trunks, that are in the root systems and all, this is not a nutrition. This is just helping to reestablish normal organisms in their appropriate places to competitively inhibit the gaining a foothold of those other harmful microorganisms. I hope that makes sense. So there's a competition for the sites on a body once the organisms are removed. So if I use a disinfectant and disinfect my skin over and over again, I'm removing good beneficial organisms and therefore more susceptible to pathogenic organisms moving in and colonizing my skin and creating inflammation, irritation, itchiness, and a whole plethora of disease processes that can happen as a result of that. So, so it's not a nutrition. So what are the things that I think are most important? Certainly, early identification and monitoring the fruit trees and knowing that it can be in your cherries, your peaches, your plums, your apricots, your crosses between plums and apricots, and I said cherries, almond trees. I know I'm forgetting some, but monitoring all of those trees for any disease processes, monitoring to see the structures that you have, like my cages have damaged the bark on some of the trees, and you can see the lack of health and vigor in the fruit that are on those limbs that are damaged. So monitoring those, raking up and removing all the fruit. If you are going to use a fungicide, I'd recommend using something to reestablish the normal flora on the surface of the plants and making sure that they're nutritionally replete as well. So we don't use fertilizers here. Now my wife does use some fertilizers, but I've only just used compost myself. So by feeding the microorganisms in the soil, those microorganisms, along with the companion plants that are associated with that plant, help to reestablish good nutrient exchange through the mycorrhizal fungi, which I've talked about in other videos as well. And this is starting to get a little bit longer than I wanted. So by making sure they're getting adequate nutrition during and after doing your fungicidal treatment, and then repeatedly, re-inoculating the tree with beneficial microorganisms. And I would, say probably every couple of weeks re-inoculating it, starting very early, so hitting them in the fall, and then very early in the spring when the fruit buds are present and you see them starting to emerge, and then when the flowers are there, giving them, spraying them with an inoculant. You could use compost tea. However, I would really be careful. I know lots of people do what they are considered composting, where it may go anaerobic as opposed to becoming aerobic. And I've done lots of videos on composting, and thermophilic composting destroys weed seeds because it's all temperature regulated. How you're maintaining appropriate oxygenation, moisturization, and thermal regulation of the organisms to maintain an aerobic environment in the compost, and that creates an environment where weed seeds are killed and pathogens are killed. Most people don't do that kind of composting, and therefore I would be reluctant to use the compost tea from that. And exudates from compost, that liquid that drains out afterwards, is not a compost tea. That's an exudate. A compost tea needs to be aerated and circulated in order to create, and you need to feed the microorganisms as well to get an abundance of the appropriate microorganisms. Then a relatively small amount can be mixed up and used to feed it. So live organisms, making sure that what you're buying is beneficial live organisms that can do the things for the plant. And certainly yeast, phototrophic bacteria, and certainly having, now there's hundreds of genera of what was formerly known as lactobacillus, and I don't even claim to know the various genera now. So I think that's about it. I think I've covered everything. Sorry, it's just me sitting here in this video and not showing you the peaches like I did in the first video, but I went on, and hopefully this is more beneficial. So if you have any comments or questions or suggestions, please leave them below. Again, I'm not a horticulturist. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a master gardener. You're getting my thoughts as a retired old fart who was a veterinarian, internal medicine, my zoology and biochemistry. I'm very interested in the science behind how we can benefit our companion species that live on the planet with us. So thanks so much for watching, and have a super fantastic and safe day. I look forward to hearing your comments. Bye-bye now. That's it, Gimbal, make some noise.